Julian and Lucy had been married for 16 years, but their marriage had grown stale. Julian buried himself in work, while Lucy turned to faith to fill the emotional void. One Sunday, Lucy urged Julian to join her at church, hoping it would rekindle their connection. Julian reluctantly agreed, stepping into a place he hadn't visited in years. As the service began, Julian's attention drifted, his gaze landing on a young nun seated near the altar. Her presence was striking, not in an overt way. She was Sister Mila, who had recently been sent to the church. Their eyes met momentarily during the speech, and Julian felt a spark of interest that he couldn't explain. After the service, Lucy introduced Julian to other members of the congregation, including Mila, whose voice was quiet but confident. She greeted Julian with a friendly grin, and he noticed her eyes lingered just a second longer than expected as they spoke. They talked about mundane topics, church events and community projects. That night, he couldn't shake the memory of her face, and something inside him stirred, a longing he didn't yet understand. The following Sunday, Julian attended church again, this time under the guise of supporting Lucy, though in truth, he was eager to see Mila. His heart quickened when their eyes met. Julian immediately offered to assist when he arrived at the church the next day. He found Mila waiting by the entrance, holding a toolbox. She greeted him wryly, and they began working on fixing an old pew together. As they worked side by side, their conversation flowed naturally. Julian talked about his job as an architect and how he loved bringing new life to old structures. Mila listened intently, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. In turn, Mila shared stories about her life before taking her vows, revealing a love for art and literature. Julian was surprised by her wit and humor, traits he didn't associate with someone in religious life. As the hours passed, their interactions grew more playful. And Julian found himself laughing, a feeling that had been missing from his life for a long time. When the work was done, Julian left the church feeling lighter, though he couldn't ignore the growing fascination he felt for the young nun. Julian began finding excuses to spend time at the church. Whether it was fixing another broken item or helping with upcoming events, he ensured his path crossed with Mila. Over time, their conversations became less formal and more personal. Julian teased Mila about her penchant for forgetting paint on her hands during projects, and she quipped back with clever retorts, her laughter ringing through the church halls. During one particularly warm afternoon, they painted a fence together, sharing stories about their lives. Julian spoke about his struggles in his marriage, though he carefully avoided criticizing Lucy directly. Mila, in turn, opened up about the challenges of religious life, admitting she sometimes missed the freedom of her preconception days. Their interactions were innocent on the surface, but the undertones of their connection grew undeniable. Julian began noticing the way Mila's eyes lingered on him. And Mila found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart fluttering whenever he entered the room. They exchanged subtle compliments, their words laced with double meanings, though neither acknowledged it aloud. A quiet understanding was forming between them, a dangerous chemistry that blurred the line between friendship and something much deeper. One rainy afternoon, as Julian finished fixing a squeaky door in the church, Mila invited him to join her for tea in the rectory. At first, their conversation stayed light, focused on the church renovation plans and Julian's architectural ideas. But as the rain poured outside, the mood shifted. Julian spoke about the growing emptiness in his marriage, revealing how Lucy's increasing devotion to her faith made him feel more like a distant spectator in his own home. "I don't even know if she sees me anymore," he admitted, his voice colored with irritation and grief. Mila listened closely, her heart aching for him in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Mila then recounted her troubles with her religion. "I thought I was confident when I said my vows," she murmured gently, peering into her tea, "but there are days when I question whether I made the right decision." In her fragility, caught off guard, Julian instinctively extended his hand, brushing hers. Though the touch was brief, it sent a jolt through them both. For the first time, they acknowledged their loneliness to each other. Their shared confessions created a bond that neither could deny, even as they both felt the weight of guilt beginning to press down. In the days that followed, Julian found himself thinking of Mila constantly, her laughter, her voice, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. All of it consumed his thoughts. In ways she hadn't experienced before, Mila prayed for strength, yet her heart betrayed her, quickening at the mere thought of him. She chastised herself for the feelings she was developing but couldn't resist the pull of his presence. One afternoon, while organizing hymnals together, their hands accidentally brushed again. This time, neither pulled away immediately. Their eyes met, and the unspoken connection between them hung heavy in the air. Mila quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. But the moment lingered in both their minds. Despite their growing feelings, they tried to maintain the facade of innocence. Yet, every interaction became charged with unspoken emotion. Their shared laughter carried an undercurrent of longing, and even the simplest gestures, a smile, a glance, held a depth that left them both reeling. Temptation was no longer a distant shadow. It had taken root in their hearts, and they both knew the line between friendship and something more had blurred further. One quiet evening, Julian stayed late at the church to help Mila organize supplies for an upcoming charity event. The dim lighting and the soft hum of their conversation created an atmosphere that felt almost intimate. As they worked side by side, their movements slowed, their proximity narrowing. At one point, Mila reached for a box just as Julian did, their hands meeting. This time, the touch lingered. Neither of them made an effort to pull away. Julian turned to face her, his expression conflicted yet intense. "Mila, I think you should leave," she said. Julian's voice shook. An agony flashed over his face, but he nodded and departed without saying anything further. That night, neither of them could sleep. Their minds consumed by the forbidden connection that had begun to unravel their carefully constructed lives. Instead, she closed her eyes, and all of their resistance broke. Julian leaned in, and their lips touched in a soft, tentative kiss. When they came apart, they were both breathless. Their emotions a whirlwind. "What have we done?" Mila muttered, her palms shaking on her lips. Yet neither could dispute that their lives had been eternally altered by their first kiss. Both Julian and Mila were overcome with shame. In their uncertainty, they avoided each other. Julian rationalized his actions, telling himself that his marriage to Lucy was already broken and that Mila was the only person who truly understood him. They tried to stay apart for days, but the more they tried, the more they longed for each other. Mila, on the other hand, was caught in an emotional tug-of-war. She prayed fervently for clarity, but her feelings for Julian grew stronger with each passing day. Eventually, their paths crossed again during another church project. This time, the tension between them was palpable. They worked in silence, their hands brushing occasionally, sending jolts of electricity through them both. Finally, Julian couldn't take it any longer. "We can't pretend this isn't happening," he said quietly. Mila glanced at him, her eyes full of sadness. "I'm not sure what to do," she acknowledged. They began meeting in secret, finding solace in stolen moments and whispered conversations. Every glance, touch, and word became a dangerous dance of longing and restraint. Their connection deepened, even as they both knew the risks were increasing with each passing day. One evening, Julian suggested they go to a secluded cabin owned by a friend of his, claiming it would provide them with a quiet space to discuss their feelings. Mila hesitated but eventually agreed, her heart torn between fear and an irresistible pull toward Julian. The cabin was small and cozy, nestled in the woods. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. At first, their conversation was stilted, filled with confessions of guilt and uncertainty. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Julian admitted, his voice raw. Mila's eyes welled up with tears. "I feel the same way, but what we're doing is a sin," she said. As the night dragged on, the barricades they had created around themselves fell. Julian reached for Mila's hand. She did not draw away. Instead, their lips touched. They surrendered to their emotions once more, this time with more urgency, allowing their desire to consume them. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within them as they spent the night together, lost in each other's arms. When morning came, they lay in silence, both knowing they had crossed a line they could never return from. "We can't keep doing this," Mila muttered, her voice shaking. Julian turned to face her, his palms softly stroking her cheek. "I know, but I don't want to stop," he said. "You make me feel alive, Mila. I haven't felt this way in years." Mila pushed away, sitting up in bed. "I'm supposed to belong to God," she murmured, her voice a mix of grief and uncertainty. "And you belong to your wife." Julian's face was a mask of confusion. "I'm not sure where I belong," he admitted. The weight of their actions hung between them like a thick fog. Both were trapped, unable to reconcile their feelings with their responsibilities. Julian returned home that day, his mind in turmoil, while Mila struggled with the conflict inside her heart. As the weeks passed, Julian and Mila's affair became a tangled web of lies. At home, Julian tried to act like nothing had changed, but he found himself withdrawing from Lucy. He spent more late nights at work, and every time they spoke to each other, their words were laced with hidden meanings. The air around them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Their lives outside of each other felt like a facade, but in their secret meetings, they found a sense of belonging neither of them had felt in years. The affair, though thrilling, became more dangerous with each passing day. One evening, after Julian had spent yet another late night at church, Lucy confronted him about why he seemed so distant. "Julian, why won't you talk to me? What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. Julian dismissed her, claiming it was just work stress. But Lucy's intuition told her there was more to it. As Lucy spent more time reflecting on their marriage, she began to notice the subtle signs of his growing distance, such as his lingering glances at his phone and, on occasion, his sudden nervousness when she entered the room. Meanwhile, Mila began to notice changes in Julian's demeanor. He appeared more distant during their meetings, his thoughts racing. One afternoon, as they enjoyed a peaceful time in the church, Mila couldn't help but ask if everything was well. Julian halted, the weight of his falsehoods crushing down on him. He said nothing. But Mila saw the remorse in his eyes and felt a searing sting in her chest. Was Julian beginning to withdraw? Was he growing bored of their affair? A new sensation rose within her, envy. The prospect of losing him, of him preferring Lucy over her, sparked a fire she hadn't anticipated. The passion they shared had become about possession. Lucy's suspicions reached their peak when she followed Julian one evening after he claimed to be working late. She trailed him at a distance as he drove to the church. Her heart pounded as she watched him park and enter the building. Not for the first time, Lucy knew something was off. And now she had confirmation. Later that night, when Julian returned home, Lucy confronted him with what she had seen. "I know where you've been, Julian," she said coldly, her voice steady but laced with hurt. "Do not lie to me. I've seen the way you gaze at her, the way you act. Tell me I'm wrong." Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He realized that the lies and deception had gone too far. His affair with Mila was no longer a secret, and Lucy was no longer willing to pretend she didn't know. Meanwhile, Mila, oblivious to the storm Julian was facing at home, felt the walls of their relationship tightening. The guilt, the fear of exposure, and the weight of their actions were becoming unbearable. Lucy's confrontation left Julian shattered. But the truth had already unraveled everything. In the meantime, Mila received a letter from her convent superiors. It was a summons to meet with the abbess. The affair was no longer a secret there. And Mila's world was beginning to unravel. Mila's meeting with the abbess was long and filled with shame. Filled the room as a stern woman, who had known Mila since her arrival at the convent, sat across from her with a disappointed expression. "You have violated your vows, Sister Mila. And your actions have betrayed the very foundation of your calling." Mila bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm very sorry. I never intended for this to happen. I never intended to hurt anybody," she whispered. The abbess exhaled heavily, her expression softening slightly. "You must understand that this is not just about you and Julian. This is about the trust you've broken, not only with the church but with yourself. You've let worldly desires lead you astray." Mila felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. And yet, part of her still yearned for Julian, for the love and connection she had found in his arms. But she knew that the path she had chosen would not allow for both. She had to choose between her faith and her love for him. She left the abbess's office that day with a broken heart and no clear way forward. The fallout from Julian's affair was swift and merciless. Word of his infidelity spread through the town, and his professional life took a hit. Clients and colleagues who once respected him now looked at him with disdain. His reputation as a respected architect was tarnished, and many distanced themselves from him. At home, the tension with Lucy reached a breaking point. She filed for divorce. "You've made your decision," she remarked coldly. "You've chosen her over us, over everything we built." Julian's world crumbled. He was now alone, without the support of his wife, his colleagues, or the life he had once known. He began questioning everything, his marriage, his choices. And most painfully, his love for Mila. Had it been worth it? Was this the life he wanted? Despite the destruction, Julian couldn't erase the feelings he still had for Mila. His heart ached for her. But he knew they could never go back to what they once had. Mila averted her gaze, her face pale and worn. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I've lost everything, my faith, my vows. My mission, all because of a moment of weakness." Julian stretched out to her, but she drew aside, hurt. "No," she responded gently. "We've crossed a line we can never come back from, Julian. We must let each other go." The finality of her words shattered him. "I cannot picture my life without you," he acknowledged, his voice breaking. Mila stood, her body trembling. "You need to find your way back to your life. I need to find mine." And she walked away from him, leaving Julian to face the consequences of his choices on his own. In the months that followed, both Julian and Mila struggled to rebuild. Julian attempted to reconnect with his estranged wife, but the damage had already been done. He spent time in therapy, trying to understand what had gone wrong in his marriage and what he truly desired from life. But he couldn't shake the guilt he felt over his affair with Mila. Mila left the convent and moved to another city in search of a fresh start. She found work at a local bookstore, but the ache of her lost love haunted her. She prayed daily, asking for forgiveness. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find peace. Their paths would never cross again, but both carried the weight of their choices. The affair had shattered their lives. But it had also given them a chance to reflect on their true desires and the paths they needed to take. It was a painful journey toward redemption that neither could fully complete. But the lesson they both learned was clear: actions have consequences. And love, when it's not true, can destroy everything in its wake. Time passed. And Julian slowly began to rebuild his career and life, though the scars of his past never fully healed. He made amends with Lucy, though they never reconciled. She moved on, finding a new purpose. But Julian's heart still ached for the life they had once shared. Mila, too, found some peace in her new life. Though the longing for Julian never left her, she lived quietly, working in her bookstore and attending church on Sundays. She prayed for forgiveness but had come to understand that some mistakes can never be fully erased. They were both different people now, shaped by their choices. The love they once shared had burned brightly, but it had also consumed them, leaving them with nothing but memories and regret. The affair had been their undoing. But it also marked a turning point in their lives, a lesson learned at a painful cost. Several years later, Julian and Mila's paths crossed once more. Though they didn't recognize one another at first. They had both attended a religious function in a small town, each living a different life. When they finally made eye contact, neither could bear to speak, knowing the pain that still lingered between them. Julian and Mila exchanged a brief, solemn glance before turning away. They had both moved on. But the memories of their affair, their love, and their heartbreak would forever remain a part of their past. It was a reminder that, while life moves forward, some wounds never truly heal.